Hello world, it's Godzilla with you once again. Hope you guys are doing well. Today, I'm back with another review. This time, Godzilla Singular Point, the new anime that just came out on Netflix this summer worldwide. What are my thoughts on the show? How does it compare to, let's say, the Godzilla anime trilogy? And maybe in general in the Godzilla franchise? What did I think of it? Did it meet my expectations? Was it disappointing? Well, find out in this review.
Surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror to wreak vengeance on mankind. A gigantic beast, cavalcade of electrifying horror.
From the beginning, episode 1 introduces our main characters, Yu Narikawa and Mei Kamino. Mei Kamino is a graduate student studying the field of imaginary creatures, and that's not a joke, apparently that's a real major. Meanwhile, Yu Narikawa works for the Otaki factory, which builds machines and advanced robotics apparently, but they also kind of go around in a little cart and go help people. And today they have a job to go to a mansion which apparently for some reason is broadcasting some random song, and they're not sure where the song comes from or what it means. And apparently a radio station is transmitting the song as well, the same radio station where Mei Kamino is working. And so they call it the Otaki crew because apparently the Otaki factory set up everything in there. Also, there just happens to be a Godzilla skeleton in the basement of this radio station. So a lot of weird stuff is happening right off the bat with this first episode. The next day, the Otaki factory crew decide to show off their robotics invention Jet Jaguar at a little town festival. Unfortunately, their premiere gets interrupted by the arrival of a Rodan, which is a smaller, more pterosaur-sized Rodan instead of the giant one we're used to, and Jet Jaguar gets ready to take on Rodan. For the first episode, there were a lot of introductions to the new characters, a lot of already developing some of the mystery that's going to happen in the show, but also it was cool to get Jet Jaguar and Rodan in their appearances, and that Godzilla skeleton was really cool to see. The second episode kicks right off with a fight between Jet Jaguar and Rodan in the town, and Rodan seemingly dies of its own wounds, apparently. The media then begins to speculate as to what this creature is or where it came from, if it's an ancient creature that's been revived or what is it. The owner of the Otaki factory, Mr. O, has a painting that kind of shows an ancient creature, I guess, that came in feudal Japan, that when the sea turns red, it will come out, and it shows multiple Rodan-like creatures on the painting along a large sea serpent, Godzilla-esque creature, so he believes more Rodans are coming. And meanwhile, at the radio facility, they're trying to figure out the origins of the bones in the basement as to where they came from. And then the episode ends with a couple of fishermen out at sea when the water turns red and more Rodans begin to fly out. This episode was pretty cool to start off with a fight between Rodan and Jet Jaguar. However, there were some scenes where Mei Kamino and this AI Pedo 2 that is helping her figure out what's going on, I found them a bit dry. They're not the most interesting. Episode 3 begins with the Rodans, flying out of the ocean and descending on a small town. So the Otaki crew have figured out a way to apparently the Rodans respond to a radio signal, so they are able to put an antenna on their little cart, and that essentially lures the Rodans towards them. But unfortunately, they run into a bus that's been tipped over on the highway. They get trapped by the Rodans, and there's a whole bunch of people still stuck on the bus. So they manage to lure the Rodans away from the bus and escape. And Mei, who and her little AI managed to take over a robot that the Otaki crew had, and this robot is able to come in and save them at the last second, and they're able to escape and lure the Rodans away from the town. This was a really cool episode because it reminded me of Jurassic Park 3, and that whole sequence with the pteranodons or pterosaurs. So I like this new take on Rodan. I think it was interesting. The episode ends with a submarine going through the ocean, and it's being followed by a large sea creature that seems to look like Godzilla, but maybe in one of his first forms. Episode 4 continues to unravel the mystery of these Rodans and where they came from and why they're all of a sudden dying. Meanwhile, Mei is invited by a professor to Dubai because of her research, and this Dubai conference is about a new element called archetype, which is basically a very advanced, almost seemingly impossible element that cannot almost really exist in our reality. It's kind of like a weird fourth dimensional, fifth dimensional element. Honestly, this part started to get a little dry for me because now we're talking about almost very advanced quantum physics or even imaginary physics at this point. And it started to get a little bit too heavy on the pseudoscience a little bit, and I think that's when I kind of started to fall off on this episode. What was cool about this episode is that Anguirus is spotted in the forest and a bunch of soldiers are going in to confront Anguirus, so it does set up the arrival of Anguirus in the show, which is always cool. In episode 5, it begins with a new sea creature being discovered and named by the government Manda. So it's cool to see Manda show up, and I really like its new design actually, and there's several of them. Meanwhile, the organization Shiva has this like big underground facility where they have all this red dust collecting. This is the same stuff that's been spotted on the Rodans. And there's this creature that's trying to basically burrow its way out of this facility, so they try and lock it in for now, but they don't know that it'll hold forever. At the same time, the army is trying to hunt down Anguirus, who seems to have this ability to possibly predict the future and is able to stop any attacks or deflect attacks or dodge attacks before they even happen because the army is trying to hunt him down in the forest. This starts to set up an epic battle between Anguirus and Jet Jaguar because the Otaki crew are coming in to basically hunt down Anguirus. And May is still trying to learn more about this archetype and how it works and how it kind of has something to do with the past and the future. This episode had some cool moments setting up like Anguirus and the showdown between Jet Jaguar and Anguirus, but I did feel like I'm still a bit lost with this whole archetype element thing. I'm not going to try and understand it too much because it just gets a little bit too much for me to try and figure out. And then also there's all these different organizations. There's like the radio facility and there's this Shiva organization, and I just think this is a bit typical of these animes that have like all these secret organizations. Which organization is which and who's who. It almost gets a little too complicated. Episode 6 begins with Rodans being spotted all over the world. Every continent seems to be swarmed by hordes of Rodans. And May Kamino is figuring out more and more about archetype from Ashihida, this guy from 100 years ago who first figured out archetype. And she's going through his notes and may be on the verge of discovering where this element really comes from. Meanwhile, Jet Jaguar and Anguirus have their ultimate showdown, you could say, in the forest. And Jet Jaguar, in a seemingly epic moment, seems to be able to take down Anguirus. The Navy is also going after the Mandas finally, but is actually attacked by Godzilla Aqualatus. It's a Godzilla, but in his first form, where he looks quite a lot like Titanosaurus. And actually, we saw this in the figure that was revealed months ago. It turns out Anguirus is still alive, so Jet Jaguar and Yunarika will go after him one more time and manage to defeat him in this really cool, epic moment. Episode 6 was full of fighting and intense action, but it's also building up kind of this apocalyptic doom that seems to be building up to in this show. In episode 7, Godzilla makes landfall in the city in his first form and begins to wreak havoc. This form actually has Varon's face on it and kind of crawls on all fours. Meanwhile, May and the Professor Lee are actually stuck in Milan because the world is being swarmed with Rodans, and they're trying to get to London, but all airports are shut down with all the Rodans and the red dust everywhere. And it seems like the world is going to hell. And meanwhile, the Shiva organization is trying to stop this creature still, which is actually named Salunga, from making its way through the facility. They have a device that looks a lot like the Oxygen Destroyer. It's actually called the Orthogonal Diagonalizer. The character BB tries to use it to stop Salunga, and what it does is it turns like the red dust into these spiky things, and it manages to trap Salunga, but he makes it fairly evident that this probably won't stop the creature forever. Also, the Ataki crew decided to give Jet Jaguar a spear, which I think is pretty cool, and it seems like they were inspired by Godzilla vs. Kong, I'd like to believe. It seems like with this episode, we're continuing this build up to kind of like all this tension and this very apocalyptic feeling that there is a cataclysm coming. Episode 8 begins with Godzilla wreaking havoc in his land form and destroying like half the city before he gets into this crystallized form, and the military is unable to break through it. The military wonders if he's even still alive. Meanwhile, Professor Lee and May Kamino finally reach Ashihara's London estate, and they find his notes, and she begins to go through them and decipher what really happened, and she begins to learn more and more about archetype. Meanwhile, the Otaki crew find the dead Manda on the beach. They also find a port dock building overrun with like giant spider-like creatures, komongas. These Kamungas also have this nice ability to regenerate, so that makes them quite a threat. This action with Jet Jaguar and the Kamungas is really cool, but also at the same time, the scenes with May explaining like archetype and now Singular Point and all this time distortion thing, I still don't really fully understand what it is, and it starts to get a bit too much, like I said, drawn out. In episode 9, the army decides to attack Godzilla, but all it does is release him into his next form, which is looks more like the classic traditional Godzilla, and now he has more of his beam that he's able to use against the military. Meanwhile, in Ashihara's estate, Mei Kamino learns about the cataclysm, as I mentioned, that Ashihara kind of knew was coming and was trying to prevent. Professor Lee tells her that Godzilla is the singular point that's kind of causing this cataclysm, which I really don't understand what that means. But yeah, basically Godzilla is releasing a bunch of red dust and going to destroy the world, I guess. And they're trying to get to India, where I think the Shiva organization is, but they're stuck, basically trapped by the Rodans, because I said travel, airlines, flights, all that stuff is cut off. Meanwhile, the Ataki crew are at the port trying to save a guy that has been captured by the Kamungas and trapped in a port building. And Jet Jaguar gets into this really cool fight sequence with all the Kamungas. It's pretty intense, especially because these guys can regenerate. Jet Jaguar is only one machine against like a whole bunch of these creatures. Lots of action in this episode, and it feels like we're getting closer to this cataclysm that's happening, and that's going to happen. In episode 10, the Otaki crew return to the mansion from the very first episode, and they discover that it's not, the mansion is not transmitting the song, but receiving it. It's actually coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from the mansion. Also, it turns out the owner of the mansion was Ashihara himself. Meanwhile, Mei finally reaches India and she meets Bibi, who's like the leader of Shiva in that research team, and he meets his daughter, and they go to a small town to meet up with Bibi, and Bibi is trying to actually take out Salunga, who has escaped and is attacking this town. And they manage to stop Salunga with the device again, but only for now, it seems. Meanwhile, Godzilla finally reaches his final form and wreaks havoc on the city. Amazing to see these scenes with his classic theme over, which I like the version of Godzilla's theme in this show. It's a nice classic but also modern rendition of it. And again, it's always great to see Godzilla just causing destruction and havoc. The Ataki crew decide to go to the radio station to find out some more information, and they find that the Godzilla skeleton is being transported out of there by this blonde journalist who's been kind of helping them out this whole time. And it seems that either he's selling it or transporting it to some unknown third party, and we're not really sure if he's a good or bad guy or what he's really involved in all this. Meanwhile, Mei and Bibi try to go to Shiva to get into the device, but turns out that Bibi also had the orthogonal diagonalizer, or several of them sent around the world in his plan to stop the cataclysm. So he's in big trouble and they want to arrest him. So they escape and decide to go another longer route to get to Shiva. So they go underground. And going underground, they find this whole underground cavern where Ashihara first discovered the singular point, it seems, and moving their way up to the facility to get to Shiva from below it this time. The Otaki crew are now in Tokyo with Jet Jaguar, and seemingly they have a plan to try and take down Godzilla. Jet Jaguar gets a random software update, but they're not sure where it came from, and now has knowledge of the song and also knows of a location that it needs to go to at a certain time and place, which seems to be right where Godzilla is in the city. We're definitely heading towards the climax of this show and building up to the final moments. Also, it was cool to see Godzilla taking down Amanda in his final form. In episode 12, Mei and Bibi make their way through the facility, and they make it to Shiva, this device that actually is able to kind of manipulate time and space, it seems, or at least try and predict the future. It's like a very super advanced calculator, essentially. Meanwhile, the government in Japan meets up with a minister, and she actually has one of the orthogonal diagonalizers that was sent to her, and they try and figure out a way to activate it and realize they need to reach out to the Otaki crew. So they go to Tokyo and run into the Otaki crew, who actually saved them with Jet Jaguar from some of the Rodans. And meeting with Yoon, he tells them that he can activate the device, but he doesn't have the code for it, and that he believes he will receive the coded message at a certain time and place in the future. So they hatch a plan together to get Jet Jaguar some propellers basically, so he can get to this time and place to get the code and activate the device, which in theory should stop Godzilla. But it's kind of dangerous because the place they go into is where Godzilla is, and Godzilla's creating this giant red dust storm that looks evil and apocalyptic. Meanwhile, back at Shiva, May and BB try and use the device, and Perops, the AI, goes into the device to try and figure out the code, because at this point they need the code for the orthogonal diagonalizer, and they need to get it to them so they can activate it, but they don't know the code, right? So they need to use Shiva. And Perops goes into the machine and is able to kind of learn more about it, but then is also distorted because basically able to go into the future and into the past, and it creates multiple different versions of itself and basically gets completely distorted and confused and overwhelmed by the time manipulation. Episode 13 is the final episode, right? We finally come to the climax of the show. May and BB are still with Shiva, but Salunga is attacking the facility and wants to destroy Shiva. And meanwhile, Perops has kind of brought itself back together after being destroyed by time and may have a solution by going actually to the past to find the code. In Tokyo, the Ataki crew are trying to get to the location and place, but they're attacked by Rodans and also attacked by Godzilla. Then Shiva is destroyed by Salunga, so Perops goes into the past and finds basically a digital boat that is able to activate it. This part I didn't really understand, but essentially Perops is able to kind of use this to get the code and find a solution. And a climactic moment right before Yun is in Tokyo waiting to get the code, but something seemingly it never happens, and then he gets knocked down by Godzilla. And right as he's about to get blasted by Godzilla, all of a sudden Jet Jaguar gets the code and turns into a giant version of Jet Jaguar and starts fighting Godzilla. So Jet Jaguar, now in his big upgraded form, reveals that he has the code for the orthogonal diagonalizer. I mean, he is the device really, and basically sacrifices himself to activate himself, and all the red dust turns blue and Godzilla seemingly is destroyed or disappears, and the red dust is gone. And that was the finale of Godzilla Singular Point. A very intense but final episode. In conclusion, Godzilla Singular Point is a pretty interesting new take on the Godzilla franchise. It features a lot of classic and favorite Godzilla kaiju, Anguirus, Rodan, Manda, then some references even to Varon and Titanosaurus. And there's a lot of monsters, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of mystery going on, and there's a lot happening, right? There's a lot of different storylines and plot points. However, I think for me, some of the biggest drawbacks of the show are this whole archetype, singular point, pseudoscience, quantum physics type things, that especially at the points when they're trying to explain it, I found myself tuning out and just not paying attention. I am glad that they tried to do something different with Godzilla. It's a different new take on it, but I also understand why some people may not like the show because, to be fair, it doesn't always focus on Godzilla. And I think one of the bigger complaints about the show is that Godzilla in his final form doesn't even really show up till the end. I was just really happy to see all my favorite kaiju again, and gear, so I haven't seen in a film in years. And Jet Jaguar turned out to be the star of the show, actually. This should have been Jet Jaguar Singular Point. I didn't think it could be done, but they made Jet Jaguar cool. They made Jet Jaguar awesome in this show. I would say that the show didn't necessarily disappoint me, but I don't think it exceeded my expectations either. Some of the sequences with the AI kind of threw me off. I think also it's a little too complicated at times, with too many characters and too many storylines. But I did love seeing the classic kaiju. I like the new takes of them. I thought Yun Arikawa was a great character. I really liked him. I'll definitely say this, it's better than the Godzilla anime trilogy. That was kind of my main bar. Is it better than the Godzilla anime trilogy? In my opinion, it definitely is. And I think I could see that some people are going to love this, some people are going to hate it. That's fine, everyone has their own different takes on it. Now the ending of the show basically teases the building of Mechagodzilla. And I think there's a lot they could do with the second season. I'd like to see what they could do with the show. I also think they should continue to use the classic characters. I'd love to see more of them show up. So You know, give me Gorosaurus, give me Baragon. I'd be very cool with that. You know, maybe bring in Mogera. I'm not really sure how big of a success it was as of this recording. Like, there's no real news on if we are getting a second season or what they're gonna do with it. But I think it's interesting, and it's cool to get just another piece of Godzilla media, right, for the Godzilla fans. But anyway, let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Singular Point. If you've seen it, what did you think? Did you hate it? Did you like it? Did you love it? Do you want to see a second season? Let me know. I want to hear from you all. That's it for this video. Like always helps the channel. Share with your friends. Subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.